I woke up to the sound of car doors slamming and angry voices cutting through the morning silence. Through my tent window, I could see three people in business casual clothing marching toward my campsite, followed by two police officers. My heart started racing as I realized they were all heading straight for me. The woman in front wore a perfectly pressed blazer and had the kind of expression that said she was used to getting her way. She stopped 10 feet from my tent and crossed her arms like she owned the place. "You need to pack up and leave immediately," she barked. "You are trespassing on private property." I sat there in my sleeping bag, completely confused. This was my family ranch. I had inherited this 40-acre property 2 years ago. I had the deed in my truck. But as I looked at those police officers and felt the weight of their stares, a terrible thought crept into my mind. What if I was wrong about everything I thought I knew? 2 weeks before that morning confrontation, I was sitting in my cramped city apartment staring at another pile of bills and feeling completely burned out from my job. The stress was eating me alive, and I desperately needed to get away from everything. That is when I remembered the ranch property my grandfather had left me. I had only visited the land once since inheriting it. 40 beautiful acres in the countryside with rolling hills, old oak trees, and a natural lake that sparkled like glass in the sunlight. My grandfather used to take me fishing there when I was a kid, and those were some of my happiest memories. The decision was easy. I would take a long weekend, drive out to the ranch, and spend a few days camping by the lake. No phone service, no emails, no stress. Just me, nature, and the peace I desperately needed. I spent the entire week planning the trip. I bought new camping gear, stocked up on supplies, and even purchased a small inflatable kayak so I could paddle around the lake. The excitement built with each item I packed into my truck. This was going to be perfect. Friday afternoon finally arrived, and I loaded everything into my pickup truck. The drive took about 2 hours through winding country roads that got more beautiful with each mile. When I finally turned onto the dirt road that led to my property, I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in months. The lake was exactly as I remembered it. Crystal clear water surrounded by mature trees, with a gentle slope down to the water's edge that was perfect for camping. I chose a spot about 50 yards from the shore and started setting up my tent as the sun began to set. But as I was arranging my camping chairs, I noticed something that made me pause. There was a wooden dock extending into the water that I did not remember being there before. It looked new and well-maintained, with metal hardware that gleamed in the fading light. I also saw what appeared to be a walking trail that curved around the far side of the lake. The path looked recently cleared and maintained, with small wooden markers every few hundred feet. There was even a small pavilion structure visible through the trees on the opposite shore. I stood there scratching my head, trying to remember if these things had been there during my previous visit. Maybe my grandfather had installed them before he passed away, or perhaps the lawyer who handled the estate had arranged for some improvements. Either way, they looked nice and well built. I shrugged it off and finished setting up my campsite as darkness fell. I built a small fire, cooked some dinner, and spent the evening fishing from the shore. The peace and quiet were exactly what I needed. For the first time in months, I felt completely relaxed. I stayed up late watching the stars reflect on the still water, listening to the gentle sounds of night creatures around the lake. This was paradise. I made a mental note to start coming out here more often. Maybe I would even build a small cabin someday and use it as a weekend retreat. Eventually, I banked the fire and crawled into my sleeping bag, feeling more content than I had in years. The The sound of gentle waves lapping against the shore lulled me to sleep faster than any sleeping pill ever could. I had no idea that in just a few hours, my peaceful camping trip would turn into a nightmare that would change my life forever. I was awakened at dawn by the sound of multiple vehicles approaching my campsite. The engines were loud and angry, cutting through the morning calm like chainsaws. I unzipped my tent window and peered out to see 3 SUVs parked along the dirt road, with 2 police cars right behind them. My heart started pounding as I watched 5 people climb out of the vehicles and start walking toward my tent. The woman leading the group wore a navy blazer and had short gray hair styled in a way that screamed authority. Her face looked like she had been sucking on lemons for the past hour. Behind her walked 2 men in golf shirts and khakis, both carrying clipboards and official-looking folders. They moved with the kind of confidence that comes from years of telling people what to do. The 2 police officers brought up the rear, their hands resting casually on their duty belts. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and threw on a t-shirt, my mind racing to figure out what could possibly be happening. Had I somehow broken a camping regulation? Was there a fire ban I did not know about? Nothing made sense. The woman in the blazer stopped about 10 feet from my tent and crossed her arms. Her voice carried the kind of authority that was used to instant obedience. "You need to pack up and leave immediately," she announced. "You are trespassing on private property that belongs to our homeowners association." I stood there in my bare feet, wearing pajama pants and a wrinkled t-shirt, feeling completely exposed and confused. My brain struggled to process what she was saying. "I am sorry, but I think there has been a mistake," I managed to stammer. "This is my property. I inherited it from my grandfather 2 years ago." The woman let out a harsh laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. "That is impossible. This lake area has belonged to Willowbrook Estates for 15 years. We have maintained these facilities and provided access to our residents since 2009. One of the police officers stepped forward and spoke in a more professional tone. "Sir, we are going to need to see some identification and any documentation you have regarding ownership of this property." My hands were shaking as I walked back to my truck to retrieve my wallet and the folder of legal documents I always kept in my glove compartment. The morning air felt cold against my skin, but I was sweating from nervousness and confusion. I handed my driver's license to the officer and pulled out the property deed and inheritance paperwork. The officer examined everything carefully while the HOA woman tapped her foot impatiently. "These documents clearly show that I am the legal owner of this 40-acre parcel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The lake is included in the property boundaries." The woman, who I learned was named Margaret Walsh, became visibly more agitated. Her face turned red as she pointed toward the dock and pavilion. "We have invested tens of thousands of dollars in improvements to this area," she said, her voice rising. "Our residents pay premium HOA fees specifically for access to these waterfront amenities. You cannot just show up here and claim ownership." The second police officer finished reviewing my paperwork and handed it back to me. "Sir, these documents appear to be in order. You are listed as the legal owner of this property according to the county records." Margaret's expression shifted from angry to furious. She stepped closer to me, close enough that I could see the vein throbbing in her forehead. "This is not over," she hissed. "We will be contacting our attorney immediately. You will be hearing from us very soon, and when you do, you will regret ever setting foot on this property." She spun around and marched back toward the SUVs, gesturing for the other board members to follow her. One of them paused long enough to take several photos of my campsite and license plate before hurrying after her. The police officers lingered for a moment to make sure I was okay and to advise me to contact a lawyer if the situation escalated. Then they too returned to their vehicles, leaving me standing alone by my tent as all 5 vehicles roared away in a cloud of dust. I stood there for a long time after they left, my heart still racing and my mind reeling from what had just happened. The peaceful morning had been shattered, replaced by a feeling of violation and confusion that made my stomach churn. How could an HOA claim ownership of land that clearly belonged to me? And what were they going to do next? I packed up my campsite in a daze and drove home with my mind spinning. The peaceful weekend I had planned was ruined, but more importantly, I needed answers. How could an entire HOA believe they owned part of my property? There had to be an explanation. The first thing I did when I got home was spread all my property documents across my kitchen table. I studied every page of the deed, the survey maps, and the inheritance paperwork my lawyer had given me 2 years ago. Everything was crystal clear. The 40-acre parcel was mine, with boundaries clearly marked and GPS coordinates that included the entire lake area. There was no ambiguity, no shared ownership, nothing that could explain the HOA's claims. But I needed to understand how this situation had developed, so I spent the next several days diving deep into public records and online research. What I discovered made my blood boil with each new piece of information. The Willowbrook Estates development had been built on land adjacent to my ranch property starting in 2009. The developer had purchased a large tract of farmland and subdivided it into a luxury gated community with 96 custom homes. Here is where it got interesting. The original marketing materials for Willowbrook Estates prominently featured exclusive lake access as one of the main selling points. The promotional website showed beautiful photos of the dock, walking trails, and pavilion, advertising them as private amenities available only to residents. I found real estate listings from when the homes were first sold, and every single one mentioned the lake access as a key feature. Some listings specifically stated that HOA fees included maintenance of waterfront facilities and recreational areas. The more I dug, the angrier I became. I discovered that current HOA fees were nearly $800 per month, significantly higher than comparable communities in the area. When I looked at the HOA budget documents that were filed with the county, I found line items for lake maintenance, dock repairs, and waterfront landscaping. They had been charging residents premium fees for 15 years to maintain facilities that existed on my private property. And they had done all of this without ever asking my permission or even informing me that they were using my land. I found photos on the HOA website showing residents enjoying barbecues at the pavilion, children playing on the dock, and families having picnics along the shoreline. There were dozens of images spanning multiple years, all taken on my property without my knowledge or consent. The most infuriating discovery came when I found the original survey maps from when Willowbrook Estates was developed. The boundaries were clearly marked, and anyone who bothered to look would have seen that the lake was not included in the development property. Either the developer had deliberately misled buyers about what they were purchasing, or the HOA board had simply decided to expand their territory without regard for property law. Neither explanation was acceptable. I contacted the law firm that had handled my grandfather's estate to get their perspective on the situation. The attorney I spoke with was shocked when I explained what had happened. This is a clear case of trespassing and unauthorized use of private property, he told me. The fact that they have been charging fees for access to your land could also constitute fraud, depending on how they represented the situation to residents. He recommended that I hire a property law specialist to handle what was likely going to become a complex legal battle. The HOA had invested significant money in improvements to my land, and they were not going to give up easily. I spent that evening walking around my small apartment, too angry to sit still. Every time I thought about Margaret Walsh's arrogant face and her threats, I felt my jaw clench with rage. They had stolen 15 years of use from my property. They had built structures on my land without permission. They had charged residents fees for amenities that did not belong to them. And when I had shown up to camp on my own property, they had treated me like a criminal. This was not going to stand. I was going to fight back, and I was going to make sure they faced consequences for every single violation they had committed. The peaceful camping trip was over, but the real battle was just beginning. The next morning, I called 3 different property law firms before finding one that specialized in exactly this type of case. The attorney, David Chen, had 20 years of experience dealing with HOA disputes and property boundary issues. When I explained my situation, he immediately understood the severity of what had happened. This is one of the most clear-cut cases of property violation I have seen in years, he told me during our first meeting. Not only have they been trespassing, but they have been profiting from your property while potentially defrauding their own residents. David explained that our first step would be to file formal trespassing complaints and demand immediate cessation of all unauthorized use. We would also need to document everything thoroughly and build a comprehensive case before the HOA had time to cover their tracks. I spent the next week following his instructions to the letter. First, I drove back out to my property with a professional surveyor and photographer to document the exact boundaries and all structures that had been built on my land. The results were even more damaging than I had expected. Not only were the dock, pavilion, and walking trails entirely on my property, but the HOA had also installed picnic tables, fire pits, and even a small storage shed that I had not noticed during my camping trip. The surveyor's report showed that approximately 3 acres of my 40-acre property had been converted into recreational facilities without any legal authority whatsoever. The estimated value of these improvements was over $60,000. Next, I installed motion-activated security cameras at strategic locations around the lake area. If the HOA continued to use my property while we were building our legal case, I wanted every incident documented with video evidence. David helped me draft formal demand letters that were sent via certified mail to every member of the HOA board, the property management company, and the HOA's registered legal counsel. The letters clearly stated that all use of my property must cease immediately, and that all unauthorized structures must be removed within 30 days. The response was swift and predictable. Within 48 hours of receiving our letters, the HOA hired one of the most expensive law firms in the region and sent back a letter claiming adverse possession rights based on their 15 years of continuous use. Their argument was that since they had been maintaining and improving the property for so long, they had acquired legal rights to continue using it regardless of who held the actual deed. They also claimed that removing the facilities would cause irreparable harm to property values in Willowbrook Estates. David laughed when he read their response. Adverse possession requires open, notorious, exclusive, and hostile use without the owner's permission, he explained. But your grandfather was the owner during most of that period, and there is no evidence he ever gave them permission. Plus, adverse possession typically requires 20 years in this state, not 15. While the lawyers were trading letters, I continued my investigation into how the HOA had been operating. I filed public records requests for all HOA meeting minutes, financial statements, and correspondence with county agencies. What I found was a pattern of deliberate deception that went back to the very beginning of the development. Meeting minutes from 2009 showed board discussions about securing lake access rights and negotiating with adjacent property owners. But there was no record of anyone ever contacting my grandfather. Instead, they had simply begun using the property and hoped no one would notice or object. When my grandfather passed away and the land went through probate, they must have thought they were safe from any challenges. The financial records were particularly damning. I found detailed budgets showing exactly how much money they had collected from residents for lake amenities over the past 15 years. The total was over $400,000. I also discovered that the HOA had taken out a loan to finance the original construction of the dock and pavilion, using projected revenue from resident fees as collateral. They were still making payments on facilities they had built on someone else's property. By this point, word of the dispute had spread throughout the Willowbrook Estates community. I started receiving phone calls and emails from residents who were concerned about what would happen to their property values if they lost access to the lake. Some of the messages were understanding and apologetic. These residents had no idea they were using private property and felt bad about the situation. They offered to help mediate a solution that would be fair to everyone involved. But other messages were hostile and threatening. Several residents accused me of trying to steal amenities that their families had been using for years. A few even suggested that I was making fraudulent ownership claims to extort money from their community. The battle lines were clearly drawn, and I knew this was going to get much worse before it got better. Margaret Walsh was not the type of person who backed down from a fight, and she proved that over the next several weeks as the situation escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. 3 days after receiving our demand letters, she organized what she called an emergency community meeting to discuss the threat to our property values and way of life. According to residents who attended, she painted me as an opportunistic outsider trying to destroy their community for financial gain. The first sign of their new strategy came when I received a thick envelope from their law firm containing a counter-lawsuit. They were not only refusing to remove their structures from my property, but they were actually suing me for interference with established property rights and demanding over $200,000 in damages. Their legal theory was creative, if completely wrong. They claimed that my grandfather had given them implied permission to use the lake area by not objecting to their activities for so many years. They argued that this created a legal easement that transferred with the property when I inherited it. David was not impressed with their legal arguments, but he warned me that expensive litigation could drag on for years if they were determined to fight. They are hoping to exhaust your resources and force a settlement, he explained. This is a common tactic when wealthy HOAs face individual property owners. The harassment began shortly after the lawsuit was filed. The first incident happened when I drove out to my property to check on the security cameras. As I was walking down to the lake, 3 residents confronted me aggressively. "You need to leave right now," one of them shouted. "This is our community space and you are not welcome here." When I explained that I was the legal owner of the property, they became even more hostile. One woman actually stepped in front of me and refused to let me pass, claiming I was trespassing on HOA property. I managed to avoid a physical confrontation, but the encounter left me shaken. These people genuinely believed they owned my land, and they were willing to get aggressive to defend what they saw as their rights. The next morning, I discovered that someone had vandalized my truck during the night. All four tires had been slashed, and "Thief" was spray-painted across the windshield in large red letters. The vandalism had happened while my truck was parked in my own driveway, which meant someone had followed me home. I filed a police report, but without witnesses or security footage, there was little they could do. The officer who took the report mentioned that they had received several complaints from Willowbrook Estates residents about me harassing people at the lake. Margaret and her allies were clearly trying to control the narrative and make me look like the aggressor. They filed noise complaints claiming I was disturbing the peace during my property visits. They reported me to the county for illegal camping on land that was supposedly zoned for residential use only. Every agency complaint was frivolous and easily disproven, but each one required time and energy to address. I had to take time off work to meet with county officials, provide documentation, and explain the same basic facts over and over again. The most infuriating incident came when the HOA hired a private security company to patrol their lake area 24 hours a day. When I arrived for a scheduled meeting with my surveyor, we were confronted by two security guards who claimed we were trespassing. The guards were polite but firm, explaining that they had been hired to protect Willowbrook Estates property from unauthorized access. When I showed them my property deed, they radioed their supervisor for instructions. After a 15-minute delay, they were told to allow us onto the property, but to monitor our activities closely and document everything we did. It was surreal to have security guards watching me walk around my own land, taking notes about my movements. David filed an emergency motion to stop the security patrols, but the HOA's lawyers argued that they were simply protecting their investment in improvements until the ownership dispute could be resolved in court. The psychological pressure was intense. Every day brought new harassment, new legal threats, or new attempts to make my life miserable. Margaret had turned what should have been a simple property dispute into a war of attrition designed to break my will to fight. But if she thought I was going to give up, she had seriously underestimated my determination. Every dirty trick they pulled only made me more resolved to see this through to the end. They wanted a fight, they were going to get one. 6 months after that confrontation at my campsite, we finally had our day in court. The Willowbrook Estates HOA had spent over $100,000 on legal fees, hired expert witnesses, and prepared what they believed was an airtight case for adverse possession and easement rights. I had spent considerably less money but had something much more valuable: the truth, backed by indisputable legal documents and evidence. The courtroom was packed with Willowbrook Estates residents who had taken time off work to support their HOA. Margaret Walsh sat in the front row wearing her most expensive suit, surrounded by 3 attorneys and a pile of legal documents that stood nearly 2 feet high. Judge Patricia Morrison had a reputation for no-nonsense courtroom management and deep expertise in property law. She had reviewed both sides' preliminary filings and seemed irritated that such a clear-cut case had been allowed to escalate into expensive litigation. The HOA's lead attorney, Richard Blackwood, opened with a presentation that was heavy on emotion and light on legal substance. He painted a picture of a thriving community that had invested years of work and hundreds of thousands of dollars in good faith, only to face destruction by an opportunistic outsider. Your Honor, Blackwood argued, my clients have maintained and improved this property for 15 years with no objection from the previous owner. They have created a valuable community asset that benefits not just residents but the entire area. To strip away these rights now would be a travesty of justice. He presented photographs of families enjoying barbecues at the pavilion, children learning to fish from the dock, and community events that had brought neighbors together for over a decade. Several residents testified tearfully about the memories they had created and the sense of community the lake access had provided. But when Judge Morrison asked Blackwood to present the legal documentation supporting adverse possession claims, his presentation fell apart quickly. Do you have any written communication between the HOA and the previous property owner giving permission for these improvements? The judge asked. No, Your Honor, but the lack of objection over such an extended period clearly indicates implied consent, Blackwood replied. Do you have any evidence that the previous owner was even aware of these activities? Well, no direct evidence, but the improvements were clearly visible and— Mr. Blackwood, Judge Morrison interrupted, implied consent requires that the property owner had actual knowledge of the use and chose not to object. Without evidence of knowledge, there can be no implied consent. David's presentation was methodical and devastating. He began with the original property deed showing clear boundaries that included the entire lake area. He presented the surveyor's report documenting that every single structure built by the HOA was entirely on my private property. Then came the evidence that destroyed any remaining credibility the HOA might have had. David presented the original marketing materials from 2009 that advertised exclusive lake access to potential buyers, knowing full well that the lake was not part of the development property. Your Honor, David explained, this was not an innocent mistake or a good faith misunderstanding. The defendants deliberately misrepresented the amenities they were selling to residents, then built unauthorized structures on private property to fulfill those false promises. The financial records were equally damaging. David showed exactly how much money the HOA had collected from residents for lake access over 15 years, and how they had used my property as collateral for loans to fund improvements they had no right to make. When it was my turn to testify, I kept my statement simple and factual. I explained how I had inherited the property, how I had discovered the unauthorized use, and how the HOA had responded to my attempts to resolve the situation reasonably. Your Honor, I never wanted this to become a legal battle, I said. I simply wanted to use my own property without being treated like a criminal. Instead, I was threatened, harassed, and sued for trying to exercise my basic property rights. Margaret Walsh took the stand as the final witness for the HOA, and her testimony was a disaster. Under cross-examination, she admitted that the HOA had never attempted to contact my grandfather about using his property. She acknowledged that they had known the lake was not part of their development, but had proceeded with construction anyway. Most damaging of all, she became visibly angry when David questioned her about the harassment campaign against me. Her mask of professional composure slipped completely as she defended the security patrols and justified the aggressive behavior of residents. He had no right to disrupt our community, she snapped. We built those facilities. We maintained them. We deserve to keep using them regardless of what some old piece of paper says. Judge Morrison's expression grew stern as Margaret continued her rant. When David asked if she believed property deeds should be respected in general, Margaret actually hesitated before answering. After closing arguments, Judge Morrison took less than 15 minutes to reach her decision. When she returned to the courtroom, her voice carried the authority of someone who had seen enough nonsense for one day. This case represents a fundamental misunderstanding of property law and basic fairness, she began. The defendants have spent considerable time and money trying to justify actions that are clearly illegal and unethical. She ruled that the HOA must immediately cease all use of my property and remove every structure they had built without authorization. She awarded me damages covering 15 years of unauthorized use, plus all legal fees, plus additional compensation for the harassment and interference I had endured. But the most satisfying moment came when she addressed Margaret directly. "Ms. Walsh, your behavior throughout this dispute has been particularly troubling. Property ownership is a fundamental right, and your attempts to deny that right through intimidation and harassment reflect poorly on your fitness to serve in any leadership position." The total award was over $300,000, and the HOA had 30 days to remove their structures or face additional penalties for contempt of court. As we left the courthouse, Margaret walked past me without making eye contact. Her expensive attorneys looked embarrassed, and several residents who had attended the hearing approached me to apologize for their community's behavior. Justice had been served, but the real satisfaction was still to come. Watching the Willowbrook Estates HOA remove their unauthorized structures from my property was one of the most satisfying experiences of my entire life. They had 30 days to comply with the court order, and they used every single one of them, hopping until the last moment that they could find some way to appeal or delay the inevitable. The dock came down first. A crew of workers arrived with a barge and power tools, carefully dismantling the structure that had been built with such arrogance 15 years earlier. I sat in my camping chair with a cup of coffee, watching every plank and post being loaded onto trucks and hauled away. The pavilion took longer to remove because it had been built with a concrete foundation. They had to bring in heavy equipment to break up the concrete and haul away every piece, leaving the area looking exactly as it had before they trespassed on my land. The walking trails were restored to their natural state, the picnic tables and fire pits disappeared, and even the small storage shed was carefully disassembled and removed. By the end of the 30-day period, there was no trace that the HOA had ever used my property. But the removal of physical structures was just the beginning of the consequences they faced. The court judgment had been widely reported in local newspapers, and the story of their illegal activities spread throughout the region. Property values in Willowbrook Estates dropped by an average of 15% once potential buyers realized the exclusive lake access was no longer available. Margaret Walsh was quietly forced to resign from the HOA board after residents learned about her role in creating the legal disaster. The property management company terminated their contract with Willowbrook Estates rather than deal with the ongoing fallout from the case. Several residents filed their own lawsuits against the HOA, claiming they had been defrauded about the amenities they were paying for in their monthly fees. The HOA's insurance company refused to cover the court judgment, forcing them to levy a special assessment of over $3,000 per household to pay their legal obligations. But not everyone in the community had supported the aggressive tactics. About 2 weeks after the structures were removed, I received a visit from Tom and Sarah Henderson, a couple who lived near the entrance to Willowbrook Estates. "We wanted to apologize for what happened," Sarah said as we sat by my lake. A lot of us had no idea that Margaret and the board were using your property illegally. When we found out the truth, we were horrified. Tom nodded in agreement. We never supported the harassment or the legal threats. We just want to be good neighbors and respect your property rights. Their apology meant more to me than all the money from the court judgment. It reminded me that most people are fundamentally decent when they understand the facts of a situation. I used part of the settlement money to make real improvements to my property. I built a small cabin near the lake shore where I could stay during longer visits. I installed proper fencing and clear signage marking the property boundaries, and I created a small boat launch where I could easily access the lake with my kayak. Most importantly, I finally had the peaceful retreat I had originally sought. I began spending most weekends at the ranch, enjoying the silence and natural beauty without any fear of harassment or confrontation. On quiet evenings when I sit by the lake watching the sunset, I sometimes think about that morning when Margaret Walsh woke me up with her threats and demands. She thought she could intimidate me into giving up my rights, but instead, she taught me something valuable about standing up for yourself when you know you are right. The lake is peaceful again, and this time the peace is here to stay.